AM Agenda.
From Oprah to federal politics, good morning. Welcome to AM Agenda. I'm Ashley Gillen. The government is under serious pressure to tinker with the banking reforms it announced just 2 days ago, with support from the Reserve Bank boss, Glenn Stevens, lukewarm at best, and opposition from the banks and the coalition growing. The Senate inquiry into banking is underway again this morning in Sydney, with some of the smaller lenders about to give evidence. Here on Sky News, we'll be showing the highlights live, and if you're interested, you can watch the full proceedings on the Sky News Business channel. For more analysis of the reforms and to look at the other political issues around today, I'm joined this morning by the Parliamentary Secretary for Climate Change and Energy Efficiency, Mark Dreyfus. Good morning to you.
Morning, Ashley.
And here with me in the studio, the Liberal MP, Paul Fletcher. Good morning.
Good morning, Ashley.
Mark, let's look at some of the things Glenn Stevens had to say yesterday. He warned there could be unintended consequences from these banking reforms. One, perhaps, was that the bank's shares went up to a combined value of some extra $3.4 billion yesterday. I'll check on that. Is that right? I'm not quite sure, actually. That doesn't seem right now that I'm saying it. But it did go up substantially yesterday on the back of these reforms. All this talk of cracking down on the big banks, Mark Dreyfus, it doesn't seem to have been interpreted that way by the markets.
Well, the first thing is that I'm not going to be commenting on share prices, Ashley. What we've got is here a comprehensive package of reforms. You need to look at all the elements together, and the purpose of the reforms is to make sure that we've got increased competition for families across Australia and businesses across Australia in the banking sector, to make sure that they are getting their loans on the most competitive basis possible. And there's a whole lot of elements to this. It has to be taken as a whole, looked at as a whole. We've got looking at portability down the track, banning exit fees in the future, introducing covered bonds so as to increase the accessibility of funding. All of these things taken together, and perhaps I should add, empowering the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, to make sure that there can't be unconscionable raising of fees, empowering them to make sure there can't be anti-competitive price fixing. All of these things taken as a whole, we think, are a worthwhile package that are going to improve financial conditions for families across Australia.
Well, on abolishing those exit fees, Glenn Stevens yesterday made this point. Have a listen.
The difficulty really is, of course, that there are actually costs to the lender in both establishing and terminating the loan that they're going to feel they need to cover. So it's a difficult area.
So, Mark, how do you expect banks will cover those costs that Glenn Stevens was just talking about for people terminating loans if they can't charge exit fees? They're just going to add on extra fees and charges elsewhere, aren't they?
That is a matter for the banks. What we're about is increasing the possibility of people being able to change banks, to select the interest rate that is most favourable to them, and one of the measures that's going to be important in doing that is getting rid of exit fees in the future.
Joe Hockey yesterday did say that he believed there would be some serious consequences from abolishing those exit fees, but even though he was slamming that plan, he wouldn't commit to the coalition actually blocking the reforms. Have a listen.
We want to see the details of this, but if they've been working on this for 12 months, Kieran, why haven't they got the legislation out now, right now, today? Why didn't they release it yesterday? You know, this is why it's half-baked.
Paul Fletcher, if these are so half-baked, why can't Joe Hockey just say, no, the coalition won't be supporting it and we don't want to see the abolishment of exit fees?
Well, actually, you're right. The prices of the shares of the big banks did go up yesterday, and that really reflects the fact that this is a package which is essentially about providing political relief for the government rather than about rate relief for consumers. Look, the fact is, Joe Hockey and the coalition have taken the lead on proposing constructive reforms in this area, and what we've seen from Wayne Swan and the Labor Party is a desperate attempt to play catch-up, and we've now got a real mix of measures, many of which have not been thought through very well at all. For example, this proposition that there should be a blanket ban on exit fees is increasingly being criticised by economists who make the point that if fees are not charged in this area, the banks will simply seek to charge them in other areas. And in policy terms, it is not a good idea to be having detailed government restriction on particular areas where fees can be charged. The important thing is to have competition, which is as vigorous as possible in the banking sector. The problem that we have is that Wayne Swan has presided over a dramatic reduction in competition. The market share of the big four banks has gone up from 63% a couple of years ago to a bit over 80% now. And he has presided over a market structure which has reduced competition in banking, and that in turn is bad news for Australian consumers.
We have seen a few experts, though, recently, over the last few days, saying there is already enough competition and that competition has increased in recent years, in recent decades. Even Glenn Stevens was talking about yesterday. But back to my question about legislation, is the Coalition going to try and block this in the Parliament?
Well, as you heard Joe say there, we will study the details, but we are struck by the fact that this is a desperately cobbled together collection of measures designed to meet a political imperative, because Wayne Swan and the Labor Party have been left embarrassed by the fact that it was Joe Hockey, the Shadow Treasurer, who took the lead on proposing policy reform in this area. We introduced a private member's bill into the House several weeks ago to deal with price signalling. And while we certainly welcome the fact that Labor is catching up with us on this issue, the fundamental point is that there's a number of elements of what's been proposed that have not been carefully thought through. So we, of course, are going to carefully study the detail before we commit in terms of how we're going to respond.
Mike Dravers, the government could be in strife here. The Independents and the Greens, they're all saying that these reforms just don't go far enough.
Well, you've got on the one hand the Liberal Party criticising the package and with the kind of wrecking behaviour that we're used to from them. On the other, we've got, and this is the consequence of the finely balanced parliament, we've got the Independents and the Greens wanting different things. We say that this is an appropriate package, it's a measured package, and taken together as a whole, it's going to improve competition in the banking marketplace. That's what families across Australia are looking for, Ashley.
Okay, Mike Dravers, Paul Fletcher, do stay with us. We do know that coming up we'll have more on the banking reforms today. We'll see in the Senate inquiry APRA, Choice, the bosses of some of the smaller lenders like Aussie Home Loans and ING will be giving evidence and their reaction to these reforms before that Senate inquiry. We'll be back just after this break. We're going to be looking at reports this morning that the government's about to sign a memorandum of understanding with Afghanistan on asylum seekers. Stay with us. Welcome back to AM Agenda. Paul Fletcher and Mark Dravers are with me this morning. Mark Dravers, I want to get your reaction to these reports today that the government's about to sign this new Memorandum of Understanding with Afghanistan, which would apparently open the way for hundreds of asylum seekers to be sent home. What exactly does that mean for asylum seekers? Does it mean, for example, that they'll be ensured that they'll be treated well when they get back to Afghanistan? What does that memorandum, what's it all about?
The Minister has made it clear that he's been working for some time with the government of Afghanistan on a memorandum of understanding that deals with the circumstances in which people who've been rejected, whose asylum claims have been rejected, can be returned to Afghanistan. And it's an important part, obviously, in any system for dealing with unauthorised arrivals. We'd prefer that people went on a voluntary basis after their claims are rejected. If they don't, it's important to have a memorandum of understanding, such as the one the Minister's working on, to make sure that it's done in an orderly way. As I say, it's an important part of the system.
And it is a win for the government, isn't it, Paul Fletcher, to get this actually signed, as it looks like it'll be any day now, because at the moment, hundreds of asylum seekers from Afghanistan are in a bit of a limbo state.
Well, Ashley, if it gets delivered, it will be an important outcome. But of course this is the government which also promised we were going to have a regional processing centre. This is a government which has made a lot of promises that haven't been delivered on. It is important because there's some 6,000 people in detention centres right now, and that includes a significant number of people whose application has been heard. They've been denied refugee status and they're therefore required to return to their homeland, but until an agreement is in place, that hasn't been possible. So if it's delivered, yes, of course we welcome it, but this government unfortunately does have a track record of promising that things are delivered well before they're actually delivered.
Okay, well, we'll all be waiting with bated breath for that to happen. It will certainly probably take the pressure off our systems if it does happen in the next few days as expected. On another issue, Mark Dreyfus, you have just arrived home from the climate talks in Cancun. What was the mood there after those disastrous Copenhagen talks? Has Cancun got the world back on track, or do you think we are still a long way away from a global deal on climate change?
I think we're absolutely back on track, and there was a very fine spirit of cooperation. The Mexican president gave a terrific speech at the conclusion of the conference where he talked about the spirit of Cancun, having established again that multilateral negotiations can work, can produce an outcome that assists the world in the fight against climate change. And what we saw was an anchoring of the pledges that were made, the emissions cuts pledges that were made after the Copenhagen Accord. We saw an establishment of the Green Climate Fund. We saw steps taken for adaptation measures to assist the most vulnerable countries, steps taken on assisting in stopping deforestation. And what it means for Australia, this agreement having been reached, is that we are on track for the legally binding agreement that we're looking for emissions cuts for all major emitting countries. What it means here in Australia is that we will now move on to do the single biggest thing that we can do, which is establish a carbon price, and that's what we're going to be working on over the next several months.
Paul Fletcher, are you as confident that Cancun has healed the wounds of Copenhagen?
Well, I'd certainly be interested to ask Mark whether the Australian delegation included the 100 or so people who went off to Copenhagen last year. But I think the important point is this. It's very hard to know what the Gillard government actually stands for when before the election we were told that there would be no carbon tax. That was apparently a commitment from Ms Gillard. After the election it seems there's a different approach being pursued. And the real problem here is that while Labor may be in government, it's the Greens who are really in power, and it's the Greens who are in many ways driving the agenda of this government. And so we hear all kinds of promises. We're told next year is going to be a year of delivery. Again, let's wait and see whether this government can actually deliver. Unfortunately, it's being driven by politics. On the other hand, we've had a very consistent policy on climate change. Our direct action policy is the policy we took to the 2010 election, and it's the policy that if we were in government we would be implementing.
Mark Dreyfus, one of the government's green schemes, I know there are a few things in there you'd like to respond to. I just want to specifically ask you, though, about the Cash for Clunkers scheme. This was, of course, announced before the last election. The plan is that the government will pay a $2,000 rebate to people who trade in their old car for a new green car. The scheme has already been delayed by 6 months. Now we've learnt that the scheme will cost 15 more times than an ETS to reduce carbon, with the Innovation Department putting the cost of abatement at around, I've got it here, $4.30, yeah, $430 per tonne. What is the point of this scheme? It was plagued by problems in the US. It's tough, isn't it, to find a supporter either from the environmental lobby groups or from the car industry for it?
The point of this scheme is that cars are responsible for around 40 tonnes of carbon emissions every year in Australia, and it's important to look for ways of reducing that contribution to carbon pollution that's made by cars. But what is very clear to me is that it's not really open to the opposition to be criticising this scheme on the basis of its supposed cost of achieving carbon emissions, when the only thing they've ever put forward is an incredibly expensive set of measures that's going to cost the taxpayers vast amounts of money for very little impact on carbon emissions with their so-called direct action scheme. And I do want to go back, as you said, Ashley, to something that Paul just said a moment ago. The real problem, he referred to a real problem, the real problem is that we've got an opposition leader in this country that thinks that the science of climate change is absolute crap. I've just come from a conference, a world conference of 194 countries, not one of which, and many of them represented by their heads of state or their environment ministers, not one of those 194 countries is in any doubt about the climate science. Not one of them is in any doubt about the absolute need for us to get on, reduce carbon emissions worldwide, and the way that we will be going about it in Australia is by setting a price on carbon, because we know that that's the most efficient way, that's the cheapest way in which Australia can make its contribution to the global effort.
Okay, let's get Paul
one of
Fletcher's
those
take on that.
schemes is
With the number of climate, the number of climate sceptics though in the party, is the coalition out of touch with what the rest of the world
let's
is
be
doing?
clear on this. We have a policy which we took to the election, which remains our policy. The Direct Action Plan involves allocating a substantial amount of money to find least cost carbon abatement. It's designed to use the market mechanism to apply a contestable process. So we have a well thought out policy on this. We wouldn't have a policy on this if we didn't believe there was a problem that was needed to be addressed.
There are a number of climate sceptics though within the party, probably more than in other major conservative parties around the world, would you think?
Actually, let's talk about the policy we took to the election and which remains our policy, which is the Direct Action Plan, which is about allocating substantial amounts of money to identifying the least cost means of carbon abatement. Which would be, I'd suggest to you, much more cost effective than things like the Cash for Clunkers scheme that you mentioned, which, as you rightly pointed out, has the fundamental problem that it's an extremely expensive way to engage in carbon abatement.
I look forward to having this discussion with both of you in the new year. I think this is going to be one of those issues that dominates 2011. Paul Fletcher and Mark Dreyfus, thank you for your insights this morning.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks, Ashley.
And that is all we have time for this edition of AM Agenda. You can